So welcome to the Religions and Practice of Peace Colloquium. I'm David Hempton, Dean of the Divinity School. Thank you for joining us for tonight's session, which RPP is pleased to be co-sponsoring with the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, which we're delighted to have as a new university affiliate of the RPP. So we're thrilled about that. I'd like to especially welcome tonight's panelists, Dr. Jacqueline Bhabha. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mohamad Al Bardan. Welcome. Nousha Kabawat, who we're hoping, weather permitting and all sorts of things happening, will be Skyping us from Beirut, but that will be an adventure. And we're also very glad to have our respondent, Alexandra Chen, with us. So thank you, everyone, especially for being with us tonight. We'd also like to express special thanks to Anne Stetson, a fellow at the FXB Center and member of the RPP working group, who herself has long experience working to advance human rights around the world. And she's been a great help in helping us conceive and plan this session. So Anne, thank you so much. We're also grateful to the El Hebri Foundation for its generous support of our Colloquium series, and to Karen and Al Budney for their generous support of this whole initiative. The topic of tonight's session is a very important one, as you know, religion and the rights and protection of children in humanitarian crises, and specifically the case of Syria. The impact of humanitarian crises on children, and the Syrian crisis in particular, is one of the most pressing matters of our time. So we're very appreciative of this opportunity to learn more about the needs and issues involved and to explore how these intersect with religion. Moderating our session tonight will be my friend and colleague, Professor Leila Ahmed, Victor S. Thomas, Professor of Divinity at the Divinity School, a member of the RPP working group since our first year, and a terrifically loyal supporter of this initiative. Originally from Cairo, Egypt, and formerly a professor of women's studies and Near Eastern studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Leila came to the Divinity School in 1999 as the first professor of women's studies and religion. Author of numerous groundbreaking, widely acclaimed, and prize-winning books on women and gender in the context of Islam, Arab culture in the United States. Her current research and writing interests include Islam and gender in America, and issues of gender, race, and class in the Middle East in the late colonial era. Professor Ahmed, Leila, thank you so much for guiding us through tonight's conversation. So I'll hand it over to you to introduce our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, President. Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be moderating this panel tonight. It's a very important subject. The ongoing tragedy of the war in Syria, as we know, has brought about a humanitarian crisis of massive proportions. Whatever their causes, whether natural or, as in this case, man-made, humanitarian disasters have a disproportionately bleak and costly impact on children, by far their most vulnerable victims, and it is their needs and rights which will be in the forefront of our thoughts tonight. A vast network of agencies and institutions of course exist from the United Nations onwards, promulgating and attempting to uphold laws around issues of humanitarian crises and human rights, including the rights of refugees and migrants, including children. In addition to international agencies, there are national entities also promulgating laws and regulations, some of these issues, sometimes laws attempting to restrict which victims of disasters, people of which ethnicity, for example, or which religion, may not be counted as acceptable refugees or immigrants. So that's just one way in which the theme of religion comes into play in relation to tonight's topic, the Syrian humanitarian crisis, a crisis that has repeatedly brought us news of boatloads of people drowning in the Mediterranean, along with unforgettable images such as that of 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi lying dead on the Turkish shore. Besides people working for the UN and other international organizations, many individuals, scholars, activists, lawyers, psychiatrists, founders and members of humanitarian organizations are all also key players in the complex geopolitical network of those actively engaged in this work, be it as academics, analysts, doctors, or others providing practical on-the-ground necessities. Among these, no doubt, as well as among UN and other workers, are some who are there doing the work that they do because of their faith commitments and who draw for strength and inspiration as they pursue such work on their own spiritual resources. So this is yet one more way, then, in which the theme of religion is implicit to our topic tonight. And this is a dimension of the subject that we here in the Religion and the Practice of Peace Colloquium feel that we as yet know all too little about. Altogether, then, we're extremely fortunate to have with us tonight a very distinguished group of panelists who bring deep scholarly and practical expertise to our topic and who will offer us insights on these and many more such issues. So let me then begin by introducing the speakers. Our first speaker will be Jacqueline Bhabha, JD, MSc, a professor of the practice of health and human rights at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She's also the Jeremiah Smith Jr. Lecturer in Law at Harvard Law School, an adjunct lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's the Director of Research at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, Harvard's only university-wide human rights research center. From 1997 to 2001, Bhabha founded and directed the Human Rights Program at the University of Chicago. Prior to 1997, she was a practicing human rights lawyer in London and at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. She has published extensively on issues of transnational child migration, refugee protection, children's rights, and citizenship. She's the author of Child Migration and Human Rights in a Global Age, Princeton University Press, 2014, the editor of Children Without a State, MIT Press, 2011, and of Human Rights and Adolescence, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2014. Her current research focuses on adolescents at risk of violence, social exclusion, or discrimination. She's actively engaged in several research projects in India, examining the factors that drive access of low-caste girls from illiterate families to higher education, and that transform gender norms among children and adolescents. She also works on similar issues with the Roma community in Europe. Bhabha serves on the board of the Scholars at Risk Network, the World Peace Foundation, and the Journal of Refugee Studies. We will next hear from Mohamad Al Bardan, an engineer, consultant, and a Syrian civil society activist. Al Bardan is a founding member and an executive director of the American Relief Coalition for Syria, ARCS, a group of 14 leading Syrian American humanitarian organizations dedicated to delivering aid and development programs to millions of Syrians in Syria and the region. Al Bardan is also a board member of the Syrian Expatriates Organization, SEO, an organization that focuses on capacity building of the Syrian civil society. Prior to coming to the United States in 2011, Al Bardan and a group of Syrian activists founded the Syrian Nonviolence Movement, SNVM, a movement formed to promote peaceful struggle and civil resistance as a way to achieve social, cultural, and political change in the Syrian government and society. He recently launched the Boston Solidarity Movement to advocate for increased resettlement of Syrian refugees in New England. Then we'll hear from Nousha Kabawat, by Skype, I believe, the founder and director of the project Amal Salam, and one of the founders of the Syrian Center for Dialogue, Reconciliation, and Peace in Toronto. Nousha has implemented trainings for Syrian activists in Amman and Istanbul in conflict resolution, negotiation, civil society building, and transitional justice, and has worked with refugee children in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and to empower the future leaders of Syria through education, intervention, and trauma-based care. As the program officer for Syria at the Center for World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution, at George Mason University, Nousha designed programmatic content for overseas courses and civil society trainings across the Middle East. Her work has been recognized by the United States Institute of Peace and featured in National Geographic, BBC News, USA Today, and Peace and Conflict Monitor. She holds a master's degree in conflict analysis and resolution from George Mason University and a graduate certificate in global journalism from the University of Toronto. Finally, we'll invite remarks from our respondent, Alexandra Chen, a child protection and mental health specialist from Hong Kong, working with refugees in conflict and in post-conflict zones. Alexandra graduated from Harvard University, AB and AM, and has worked for several years in the Middle East and Africa, most recently as mental health and psychosocial advisor to UN agencies on the Syrian crisis. Prior to this, Alexandra worked on child protection and trauma therapy projects in Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Ethiopia, and Somalia, on education and peace building in Lebanon and Iraq, on Islamic legal reform in Egypt, among others. Currently, Alexandra is pursuing a PhD at Harvard Graduate School of Education, studying the impact of refugee trauma on children's brain architecture and cognitive functioning. Alexandra speaks 10 languages, including Chinese, Arabic, and French. Jackie, may I?
Thank you so much, Leila. So thank you very much to the Dean for inviting me, and to Anne Stetson. Thank you, Leila, for your very generous introduction. And thank you to all of you for being here and for caring about this issue, which is so pressing and so hard to really address in an adequate way. So I thought I would focus my comments on children who are either refugees or who are seeking asylum, and give you a sense of some of the challenges that they face. Just to start off with, I wanted to share a very contemporaneous note from a colleague who just returned from the now famous or infamous island of Lesbos in Greece, which is only about 40 minutes from the coast of Turkey, and has become one of the main crossing points for refugees fleeing from Syria into Europe. So our colleague, who is from the island herself, just came back after 2 weeks of a rapid assessment we asked her to do, and shared this very concerning set of facts about what's happening to children. She said, in plain daylight, refugee children in the settlements where they are living are engaging in transactional sex in order to make ends meet and in order to find fees to pay smugglers so that they can move on to the next area, given that the border with Macedonia is closed and the only way of moving on to Western Europe, which is where they want to go, is by paying somebody to smuggle you across the border and maybe get you false documents. So these children, she said, it's just open for anybody to see, and it's shocking that these are places where children are meant to be protected by the international community in cooperation with the Greek authorities. The other thing that she said, which is very concerning, is because the extent of support for the camps and the settlements of refugees, because the extent of support is so deficient, there's enormous stress and hostility and anger within the camps. And so kids are now getting into fights with each other. And she said in the last month, all the formal settlements have actually been set fire to by angry teenagers. So you get this impression of a place which is meant to be a place of safety for people fleeing war, fleeing intolerable circumstances, turning itself into something approaching a living hell, where children are, prostituting themselves or being told to do so by their families, and where, kids are really forming gangs in the camps. So that's really a very dark picture, I think, as dark as the reality maybe left behind of children fleeing bombing and war, or children fleeing, in the case of Afghanistan, recruitment by the Taliban. So that's really the first example I wanted to just give you of a real deficit in protection of children, which is, I think, all of our responsibility. The second kind of nugget a second sort of fact picture, if you like, of concern about children is closer to Syria, which is in the region. We know from colleagues who are working in Lebanon and in Jordan and in the other surrounding countries, and I know we'll hear from experts more after I finish speaking, we know that there are very serious child protection issues in those settings too. We know that very significant numbers of children are not in school, despite the fact that every child is supposed to have a right to primary education, irrespective of their status. So, of course, it raises the question, well, what is the value of human rights if in these most critical of circumstances we're not able to deliver protection? Why is it that significant proportions of children are out of school, and many of those children are engaged in child labor? We have clear evidence of very young children, sometimes 4 and 5 years old, who are working in the fields from morning to night, or who are doing other odd jobs to support their families. So a real deficit there. And other very concerning protection issues too. We know that vaccination rates have dropped dramatically, and this for a population that was really pretty well catered to. Syria, after all, was a country which had a robust and I think in the region, a very impressive health system. So to go from that to a situation where children now are not being vaccinated, and where we hear about outbreaks of diseases long since gone, is again something extremely alarming. And then to add to that, we also have evidence of an increase in child marriage, an increase in child labor, as I've said, an increase in child abuse and violence, and of course, correlated with all of that, something that maybe Alexandra will mention, quite severe increases in childhood trauma, obviously. So accounts of children returning to bedwetting, nightmares, acting out, aggressive behavior, inability to concentrate, and so on. So that's really that's the kind of starting point from which we have to kind of improve. That's the challenge we have. So the question is, why? Why are we in such a dire situation? This is not a brand new emergency. And this isn't unexpected either. First of all, children have always moved before, during, and after conflict. There's nothing new. In fact, if we look globally, the proportion of children who are migrants today is the same as it was in 1950. It's just obviously the absolute numbers have gone up as the absolute population has gone up. So, this is nothing new. Some people say, well, but children haven't been as visible before, and I often get asked this question as somebody who's done some work on child migration. Why are so many children suddenly moving? And the answer is, well, children have always moved, but we are maybe paying more attention now because their concentration has changed. So a lot of children, including a lot of unaccompanied children, have recently moved into our sphere of attention. They're not just in the DRC or in South Sudan or maybe, in Southeast Asia, moving from Malaysia, from Myanmar to Bangladesh, but they're in Europe, or they're at the border between Mexico and the US. And so we're paying attention. But the reality is that actually we were paying attention, at least the international community was paying attention way back. In 1979, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, which is the lead organization responsible for refugees, produced a handbook, a sort of guide to how to interpret countries' obligations towards refugees. And it has about 6 or 8 paragraphs on unaccompanied children right there. That was 1979. So if we really had the political will, we would also have the competence, because many of the guidelines that we're working on today and that we're trying to get recognized today have actually been soft law, if you like, for 40 years. So, for example, in the UNHCR handbook, there is an explicit statement about the importance of paying attention to the age and maturity of a child when you're questioning a child or when you're dealing with a child. There's explicit articulation of some basic standards, including the importance of recognizing what's in the interests of a child, which may well be different from what's in the interests of an adult. And most important, there is a very explicit statement that for every child who is in need of protection, there has to be a best interest assessment followed by a best interest determination. So what is that? That's sort of rather jargony, but what does that mean? That means that both the state in which a child arrives and the international community more generally have an obligation, first and foremost, to look at the circumstances of the child and ensure that they're safe, that the child has shelter, that the child has access to water and to food and to basic medication and to primary education. That's a sort of basic assessment of need before you start looking at whether they are really a refugee or not, or whether they are really related to somebody they're traveling with or not. You have a protection obligation which precedes the option or the obligation to concern yourself with their legal status. And then, once you've had that best interest assessment, you're meant to make a best interest determination. You're meant to make a formal decision about what is best for that child or the group of children. And even in those days, in 1979, UNHCR was saying that should be a written determination which was appealable. Now, that's very important. That means that there could be a formal decision by whoever is concerned, which gives you the reasoning behind the strategy that's being adopted. It's not just up to an immigration officer at the border to put a child in detention. It's not just up to border patrol people here to send a child from Honduras back to Mexico. It's not just up to people on the Greek coast to say, well, we now have an agreement with Turkey, and so we're going to send this family back, and then they've got to get in line with everybody else. That's been anathema in international law for the last half century, because we recognize the special needs and the special vulnerabilities of refugees. So I guess my first point here then is that we're in this situation in a way because we haven't had the political commitment to follow through on the sort of paper or theoretical obligations that we set ourselves after World War II in the kind of edifice that we constructed. So I just wanted to give you a couple of figures and then make a couple of comments, tying in also a few remarks about the relevance of religion, which is not at all my expertise. So in terms of numbers, just to give you a few figures, not to bombard you with figures, but just to give you a few figures, according to UNICEF, the UN organization responsible for children, of the 31 million children living outside their country of birth, 11 million are child refugees or child asylum seekers. Out of 31 million, 11 million. So that's roughly 1 in 3. That's an enormously high ratio. The equivalent ratio for adults is 1 in 20. So that gives you a sense, and that's of course because many adults will travel, be outside their country for work or for other reasons. But for children, many of the children who are outside their country are actually in a very vulnerable situation, to the tune of 11 million. So this is a very substantial problem. It's not just a Syrian problem, though Syria is at the moment the most acute instance. Of the children who are of concern, who are child asylum seekers or refugees, 45% at the moment come from Syria or Afghanistan. So the problem is certainly very localized right now. But there is also massive internal displacement. We shouldn't, when we think of children who are vulnerable because of migration, it's not just children who cross an international border. It's also children who are internally displaced. And if you think about it for a second, you realize that actually in some cases, in many cases, people who are internally displaced are even more at risk than people who've managed to flee. Because whatever the persecuting or oppressive situation that's caused them to be displaced is, it's much closer to home, and they don't have access to an international community. And this we know to be the case in Syria. We know that about half of the population of this country, of I think 21 or 24 million people, half of the country has been forced to move or to leave. And the majority are internally displaced. And many of the people who finally make it to the refugee camps or settlements in the neighboring area or further afield in Europe, many of them have been displaced 3 or 4 times in Syria itself before they felt able or compelled to leave their country. So we have to think of internal displacement too, and that's a massive issue in Africa, a massive issue in Central America, and I won't say more about that now. So just to wrap up and to say a few words in conclusion, how should we be thinking moving forward? And I have 3 main points I'd like to make. The first is I think we should go back to the drawing board that we set out 40 years ago. Many of those basic principles about the importance of making a best interest assessment and a best interest determination are as true now and as relevant now as they were then. So we really need to generate a cadre of qualified experts who know how to handle children in this circumstance. And it's not the same as handling adults. So we at the FXB Center actually have recently created a child protection curriculum. And one of our goals is to increase the cohort of people who have relevant training to make it more possible for people from many different walks of life to do this work. So that's the first thing. We need to have the commitment, the political will, and then the government commitment to generate this expertise. Secondly, I think we need to think much more about how responsibility is shared, and this is not a particularly original or new insight on my part. It is impossible to effectively protect large numbers of people when only a 10th or a 20th of state actors are coming forward to participate, where you have a situation where the disproportionate number of people are entering 1 or 2 countries and other countries are doing nothing. We have to find ways to create a more holistic sense of responsibility, to kind of in some way temper the iron wall of national sovereignty and to think more in terms of humanitarian responsibility. And I think it's not as impossible as it might seem, because countries are always reluctant to put themselves out as being completely opposed to helping. Of course, there are examples like Hungary, who, famously Orban, Prime Minister Orban, went on record to say he didn't have any mosques and he didn't want any Muslims. But that's, fortunately, is the exception. So I think that's the second thing. But thirdly, I would say that actually the obligation to generate hope and a sense of a viable future rests with all of us, because I think what we're seeing is a new generation, a new diaspora, like the diaspora created in the 1940s and 50s by the events that took place in Europe. Where you have now, people scattered all over the world whose parents and grandparents were forced to flee. And we're seeing that again. That's now the situation that's manifesting itself. So the hope that comes from religious faith, the hope that comes from a sense of a viable future, I think that's something that every citizen can actually contribute to in some way. So I'm very grateful to have had this opportunity to talk to you and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jacqueline. Thank you, Dr. Jacqueline. Thank you, Liz, Dr. David, and Dr. Leila for organizing this, and thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here. So I splitted my talk into two main parts. I'm going to talk more about one of the organizations that I was honored to be a founding member in. It's called Harass Network, the Child Protection Network, and their amazing job there, and there are challenges now in the war circumstances, and what also the religion aspect has to play with this. But before that, I would like to briefly talk a little bit about the history of religion in the Syrian society, and mainly in the civil society, and the background of mainly it was more a group of communities rather than, because the civil society was officially born in 2011. So I just want to briefly talk about it before 2011 and how it was established later on. Before 2011, Syria considered to be a secular country. I mean, there was religious freedom there. However, there was no dialogue between the communities. You kind of find people are grouped into based on their sects and religions, and that was due to the absence of political freedom and freedom of speech and all of that. However, you don't find hate between those communities. A little bit of tension maybe between the majority, the Sunnis and the Alawites, due to some historical issues. One of them goes back to the Hama massacre back in 1982, since it has some religious aspect when the Muslim Brotherhood rebelled against Hafiz al-Assad regime, and the latter demolished the city and killed more than, the number varies between 10,000 to 40,000 people at that time, and there was no opportunity to talk about it, and it was kind of prohibited discussion to have later on. So you still find these tensions here. Also, it was more a question for everyone. It's totally fine in a secular society to have a president from a minority, but it's not fine or okay to have him use his sect to control every single aspect in the government and military, and so. Coming closer to, just to start, I grew up in Syria and just moved here September 2011. So I got to witness the first 7 months of the uprising. Coming closer to 2011, after the revolution, I was working in one of the biggest telecommunication network. I witnessed how the change in the society, the dramatic change in the society, it was shaken dramatically at that time in the way of priority and how people are getting grouped. I remember how people used to hang out with their fellows. I mean, religious people used to hang out for lunch and together with their other religious fellows, depends on which religion are. Christians are together, Muslims are together. There was no hate, as I mentioned, but also secular people, liberals used to hang out at the same time. After 2011, March 2011, that was really shaken dramatically, and you start seeing people grouped in a totally different way. Based on now their political affiliation. So people start to align along political lines rather than sectarian lines as before. This background is very important to know how the civil society backgrounds and diversity and how this background helped us to going forward to work on our challenges and having a more a national dialogue. So I would say there was almost the Syrian identity was kind of vague before 2011. Started to, for the first time, to create an identity at that time. Unfortunately, things went very well in the first 2 years. Since the war continues, nothing goes well with war. Actually, circumstances we start seeing back some radicalization in the communities. Maybe since I can see that Nousha can hear us, like, I mean, someone from the Kabawat family now is closer to any kind of people with political affiliation, regardless of their religions, rather than any other fellows from that has a gray perspective on the on that political vision. So. They were accused at some point of being a brotherhood, also Muslim Brotherhood at some time. Getting back now to, and I was trying to explain that because when we have started working on the, officially the civil society was born at around that time. People trying to work on change, as I mentioned. I've been able to work with some people back in Damascus to establish something called the Syrian Violence Movement, and the Huras Network, the Child Protection Network, was one of the projects, result project out of it. So I'm going to share a little bit of our programs and what we have been doing, some of our struggle and challenges with the religion, and also the good part of how to say the pros and cons of religion's role in our program. So mainly our programs are we're working on 4 specific programs for now. The first one is the psychosocial support. I mean, with that program, we at some specific villages we had to go to do some formal and informal education. Mainly, we're based in 3 specific areas. The first one is in Dar'a city. The other one's in Idlib rural areas, and also at the eastern Ghouta. So far, we have dealt with and we have been working with more than 287 students in eastern Ghouta, 2,650 students in Idlib rural, and more than 1,600 kids in the city of Dar'a. Our focus is more to work on the psychosocial support. But as I mentioned, it's not something easy at all because of lack of education, lack of schools in some of the villages. We had to jump in sometimes to perform the role of education and a formal education like the exact curriculum that have been taught for years in Syria, and in some areas also to do some special type of education for the people who left out of school for some time and like to let them catch up with their original class again. And the psychosocial, we have 3 levels of psychosocial support. The first one is more to do more recreational activities, some fun activities with the kids, listening to them, especially with the one who have traumas and issues, and also sadly we educating them about some of the emergency explosive materials and what to do in those circumstances, and especially at the time of airstrikes and aerial bombarding. The level 2 is more targeting people with special needs and like having issues, more working group sessions to listen to them and having them listen to each other, and a more intensive part of that. The third level is more about what we call exactly, it's a special program called case management. This is where we use most of our skills and techniques. So it's more like we work on each kid as a specific case. Once we receive once where the kid is registered in our system, we assign a guardian, as we call, since like we're for this kid, and stays with and review his case and has a session with him, like on a weekly one-to-one psychotherapy session. Also have a monthly visit to the family or the caregiver, since many of the kids they lost their families in some way in those areas, to collaborate and support and provide support. In most of the scenarios, actually, we're working on providing some financial aid for the families to avoid. Because if you look at the statistics, most of the biggest reason of child recruitment in any activities, in labor activities or in armed activities, is the financial reason. So we had started a program that where we pay the family the same exact rate that this kid might have from a brigade or any kind of armed branch, and in the condition that this kid has to come to our school, one of our schools or other kind of schools, and they receive the same amount. So usually parents for sure, or any caregiver would take that choice over any other choice. So again, that was the main. In the main case, in some of the cases we have dealt with, like we had to go to work with local authorities and community services. So here we're the religious background of the civil society now it comes like to play. I mean, due to the diversity, which helped us a lot to deal with a lot of cases, for example, with some of the armed group, where like religion is a major aspect there, to bring some of our religious members to deal with that on a discussion based on religion to get to the same results of like where we want, or the best interest of the child himself or herself. At the same time, the diversity of the team itself helped us to have a lot of discussions and agree on a scientific and professional way to deal with that. There's no, since especially where people sometimes consider bringing up kids and education systems as not as scientific as, for example, medicine or other type of scientific fields, where we had to go through over a lot of discussions with parents, and so that this is more a scientific, like you have to go back to the guidelines and see where and how to deal with those kids at that time. The third program is more capacity building. We provide trainings and mainly for school teachers, educational supervisors, school administrators, and also parents. And we offer a lot of programs, just to depends on the cases. So one of the programs is called Peace Education Program. We try to have to develop more a conflict resolution skills for those teachers and trainers to be able to trainees to be able to handle issues in classes, and also at the same time how to manage to get into an environment with less tension, especially during war circumstances. The other program is communication with children, since those programs are mainly for teachers, and we train teachers and educators at that point. Also, we provide, since dealing with kids who are internally displaced or refugees is something require more advanced skill to have. So we work on teachers, like also to provide them on, especially about like the situation of kids and how it should be handled. One of the biggest of our programs is called the emergency educations, as wars, conflict, like have always had a significant impact on educational efforts, and the negative impact that leave in the society. So we try to lighten the negative psychological effect of the conflict on children by providing environment of routine stability, and also like more hope for the future. For example, I had a lot of phone calls with some of the guardians on the ground, just to before the lecture, just to check on like some examples about the religion role in the society. And I mean, answers or examples were differ, like from a good, like from a positive to a negative part. So one of the guardians told me, I would say religion improves the children resilience because of the craziness that's happening, for example, especially in Aleppo now and in the northern of Syria, especially to the recent atrocities by the Syrian government and the Russian air forces. Religion sometimes can answer some of those tough questions. Where did my dad go? Where are the rest of the students that they were supposed to come to our class today? Why they are hitting our school? What did we do? So all of these questions, sometimes, I mean, either we agree with that or not, but religion can provide some of the answers, at least temporary answers for those kids at that time, that, okay, your dad just went to heaven. I mean, so there's justice after life. There's, you will take your rights back sometime. So it's not, and it helped them, at least for them to continue on their daily life and having. Also at the same time, religion has a huge role on the collaborative efforts between the communities, especially for for tragic events on kids and families, and it was very clear that played a huge role on the support and solidarity at this point. At the same part, also it plays some negative roles due to specific religious beliefs. For example, we had some issues with the local authorities, since now local authorities depends from area to area, like for a homosexuality issue for some kids, and we had to intervene to at least help to avoid any punishment that can approach, and like work on these cases to help to be the entity that's going to deal with the kids, not the authority, which has no scientific part in this. Like, we're dealing with on a religious perspective, and there's a lot of religious controversialness on this part. So we had to intervene for many cases. The last training program is more about working with parents. Also, since war has its own impact, so we had to, for example, like to work on parents for more awareness in their role in prevention of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and very importantly, the forced marriage, or early marriage for the kids. We have done a huge awareness campaign on that part, since unfortunately, I mean, the war sometimes push families to more into that marriage could help them at least take less responsibility on their kids and so on. So it takes the society a little bit backward on that part. I have only 1 minute, so I just want to talk quickly about the last program, which I was involved in. It's called it's a magazine that we have developed and distribute in the inside Syria. It's called Tayyara Wara, or Kite in English. So maybe the first kids magazine that I've seen was published inside Syria has this amount of critical thinking and push towards more big terms, and helps kids on challenging some of the some of the important. I wrote one of the articles back in the day about pluralism in the society, and I had some editors to work on it just to make the language as simple as for kids to understand. We have distributed more than 60,000 copies over the last 6 months, so almost an average of 10,000 copies a month. And the important role of such a project is due to the lack of printed curriculums in the area. So we're using those curriculums for more than one shift, so the kids cannot take those curriculum back or printed books with them back home. So the only piece that can be left with the kids is like a magazine or something to play or read in their homes. I still have a lot of things to mention. I think the time is up, so I'll leave it to the Q&A. Thank you again.
Thank you. This is Nousha Kabawat.
Good evening. I'm not sure if you can hear me, and I can hear myself, that's true. But bear with me. I guess if it doesn't work out, I'll turn off the camera. I'm really happy to be with you all this evening, and I'm really honored. I'm very excited to be on a panel with all these wonderful people, especially Mohammed, who has done such incredible work for Syria. It's really an honor. I wanted to shift the conversation a bit. I think I'd like to tell you a bit about myself, because I was once a Syrian child, and then maybe talk to you a bit about the work of Project Amal, Salam, and maybe some of the experiences we've had with teaching about religious tolerance and with the kids. So I grew up in Damascus, which, as all of you probably know, is the oldest inhabited capital in the world, and I grew up in a family ancestral home. Growing up there, I got to experience a very different side to Syria than the one you all see today. And I feel truly blessed to have been able to skip down the street called Straight every day as a child. This Syria was filled with history, with tolerance, with love, or so it seemed. My parents, they transformed our home into a meeting place for people from all walks of life to discuss the past and future of our great Syria. At a young age, I was exposed to different people and cultures because my parents believed that the best education was the one that life would give me. Religious tolerance was one of the things my parents stressed the most in our home. One of the biggest taboos for them was asking someone what the religion was, because it simply did not matter. In 2013, after the revolution began and violence began after that, I found myself at an internally displaced people's camp in Syria. This was 2 years after I had left Damascus, as the people took to the streets demanding their freedom. I wanted to see how I could give back to a cause I still believed in. And so while I was there, I came across a large group of very young Syrian children. And these kids were not only not attending school, but they were also mimicking this language of hate and anger that they heard from the adults and their parents. And the parents were angry for speaking in this way because they had lost everything. But hearing the children speak this way, I wasn't only worried, I was scared. I thought that this would someday be the generation of children that would have to go back and rebuild Syria. So I knew at that point that I had to do something that would feed their self-esteem. I knew I had to do something that would change the way they saw the world and themselves. So I once read a quote that said, "Children are great imitators, so give them something great to imitate." And that's what I decided to do. So I was inspired by my own memories as a child in Syria, and I imagined a series of floating workshops that would give these children a new outlook on life, a new outlook on the world around them. And this led me to found Project Amal. And through education, intervention, and trauma-based care, Project Amal, which means Project Hope and Peace, has been able to inspire, empower more than 6,500 children in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and inside Syria. And we've done this with the help of over 100 volunteers from all over the world. So Project Amal identified through a bottom-up approach the unique needs of Syrian refugee children by building a testable core approach to innovative emergency education. This was an ambitious and audacious task. I was young and I didn't really know what I was doing. But as such, Project Amal has over the past 3 years become much more than just a project. We've now become a global movement which connects people from all over the world with a passion for innovating human rights, education, and civic change. You guys can hear me? Yes. Okay. Wonderful. So Project Amal Salam has identified 3 challenge areas that have been addressed in our core innovation pillars for emergency education. The first is building local capacity. The second is humanized education. And the third is inclusivity for all learners. We leverage our diverse and extensive network in the Middle East and around the globe against an innovative strategy to meet the educational and psychical needs of Syrian refugee children, which are usually overlooked by traditional aid workers. Our main goal is to ensure that every child has the right to an education, a childhood free from trauma and violence, and most importantly, especially for me, is the hope for a peaceful tomorrow and to return to Syria. Some of the highlights of our program include, we run twice a year in Lebanon, Turkey, our biannual workshop, where we bring together about 30 volunteers from all around the world. And during these workshops, we use art, music, sports, photography, and health activities, which I've designed using conflict resolution theory to push the children and the youth to tackle questions about the future of Syria and the role that they can play in rebuilding it. We have a small, humble school in Jordan, which hosts up to about 80 kids each year. And this serves as a transitional school, where we bring kids who have missed several years of school because of the conflict and help them catch up on those years so that we can then register them in the formal Jordanian system. We fund transportation for about 70 kids in Jordan to attend an informal education center where they offer psychosocial support. We focus a lot on educator and volunteer professional development, which includes training on innovative education tools and how to work with children who have developed trauma. We have many other activities that we can get to, but I know we don't have that much time. The project the team's education has demonstrated consistency in providing a safe and sustainable space for these children to grow and learn. We make sure that we have positively influenced the children and the communities we work in before we move on to the next project. This enabled our team to progress and to learn with each step that we take. We embrace experimentation and we try to track every mistake and lesson learned while designing the net so that we continue to grow our work and that we execute every project in a timely manner. So I get asked a lot if these types of programs really affect change or have long-lasting effect on the children and youth we work with. And one of my favorite stories to tell, and it happens to be perfect for this topic, is this following story. So last year I was running an arts workshop in the Zafir refugee camp, which is the second largest refugee camp in the world. And I introduced this activity that I've designed, which is called Rebuilding Your Camp. This activity helps kids envision a future free from conflict. They use art supplies to rebuild Syria, basically. So I asked the kids where they would go if the conflict was over. And they usually all yell, to Syria, to Syria. And then I asked them, so what will we need in this new Syria? And they start to shout out their answers with enthusiasm. Schools, hospitals, parks, police stations, shopping malls sometimes. So this activity is designed to have the kids really understand that they will need to rebuild Syria and that they are the most important players in a peaceful and prosperous Syria. So then I asked the kids if there was room for Christians in this new rebuilt Syria. And their answer was very clear. No. There was no room in Syria for Christians. So I felt very disappointed. I am a Christian, and while I'm not necessarily religious or attached to this faith, I am attached to the idea of acceptance and tolerance. And the idea that the children felt this way at such a young age, me worried. And at that moment, I even hesitated telling them I in fact came from a Christian family. But then I said it, you know, kids, I'm a Christian. And the kids stared back at me in complete shock and in total silence. And at that moment, the kids eventually broke the silence. And apparently many of them had been told that Christians do not believe in God. And they had also been told that all Christians were supporting the regime. So when I began to explain to them that Christians believed in the same God that Muslims do, and that not all Christians supported the regime, and that we shouldn't lump people together, they looked at me puzzled, as if I had just shattered what they had always thought was true. And it's really important here to note that the kids were not saying these things because they hated Christians, but they didn't know. For probably all of these kids, I was the first Syrian Christian they'd ever met. And they started asking me, do you pray? And how do you pray? And then they started asking me, are you sure you're Syrian? Are you Jordan? And at that point, my colleague, Salam, jumped in. And he's a Sunni Damascus native who had been volunteering at Baghdadi since late Syria 4 years ago. And he asked the kids if they knew the story of the Caliph Omar. And they all shook their heads. No, they didn't. He told them how the Caliph Omar, who was the second Caliph of Islam, he made his way to Jerusalem to sign a peace treaty. And this treaty says, and I'm quoting here, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are granted security of life and property. Their churches and crosses should be secure. This treaty applies to all people of the city. Their places of worship shall remain intact. These shall neither be taken over nor pulled down. People shall be quite free to follow their religion. They shall not be put to any trouble. So at that point, Salam asked them, if the Caliph Omar wanted to protect Christians and their places of worship, shouldn't we want to do the same and follow his example? And so the kids were just staring at me and Salam standing there next to each other, a Muslim and a Christian, side by side. And we waited as our message started to sink in. It looks like they were absorbed with this idea that Syria could in fact belong to Muslims and Christians and maybe people from other religions as well. So I then asked them, so who's ready to rebuild Syria? And who wants to build a mosque and a church in our arts activity to rebuild Syria? And they took their seat in a small circle, and they started grabbing the art supply that I laid out on the ground, and they started to rebuild Syria. And they built both a mosque and a church next to each other to rebuild the city. So the story works. And all it took was presenting to the kids a different way of seeing things, educating them on what can be and what should be, to move beyond what they thought they knew. Again, while I'm not necessarily a religious person, and never really have been, I believe in instilling values in the children of Syria that we want to see in our new free Syria. I want them to learn acceptance, to learn love, and to learn about forgiveness. While Project Amal Salam steers clear from politics and religion, because we don't believe that these are things that children need to address anyway, we do educate our children about the importance of being here. Amal Salam to its wide network of volunteers who come from all over the world. They come from different religions, different political beliefs, different skin colors. This has shown the Syrian children that humanity is not defined by our faith or our ethnicity. And by exposing these children to volunteers who come from every corner of the world, who are there to simply put a smile on their faces, we are building a generation that will not see the unfamiliar or the unknown as an enemy, but embrace them as an ally and a friend. There's a very famous quote that says, enemies are people whose stories you have not heard or whose faces you have not seen. And we believe that through our work, we're breaking down walls that separate people based on religion or where you come from. And we're creating a better world for these children to grow up in, at least in their hearts and in their minds. And this is based on love and acceptance. I think that all religions share a common message that is focused on loving your enemy and respecting the other. And I think religious communities, especially in Syria today, especially Christian communities, you need to embrace those messages. We need to stand with the oppressed, and we have to say that as a minority group, we do not accept that you protect us without protecting the majority. I don't know how much time I have, but I'll say a couple more things. I think today's humanitarian efforts are working really hard to protect children. However, the situation has made it almost impossible, especially inside Syria. Amal Salam, our project, we built a community center in Aleppo in January, which was underground. And the volunteers in Aleppo approached us and said, we want to build a center so that the children have a place to go and play and learn in the neighborhood. And we just wanted to give them a place where they feel safe and where they could just be kids. However, because of constant bombardment by the same regime in Russia, our team is unable to guarantee the safety of these kids. We're not able to guarantee the safety of our volunteers at this point. And today the center, I just got a call from them yesterday that the center is being used as a shelter, where the whole team and their friends are spending their nights there trying to flee death. So many organizations are building schools and are building hospitals to support Syrian children and their families. But in return, they are purposely targeted and destroyed. So I think when we talk about children's rights, the most basic right is the right to learn. And the most urgent need is to protect children in Syria and to take a step against bombing schools. I mean, can you believe that this is something we even have to talk about? Schools are being targeted and completely destroyed. Parents send their kids to school, and some days they just don't come back. And the biggest mistake the parent made today was thinking his child deserved an education. Picture that. In Lebanon and Jordan, you have thousands of children who are not enrolled in school, like the first speaker had mentioned, and forced into child labor. I walk down the streets of Beirut every night to just be circled by dozens of children begging for money and telling flowers. And when I give them a little bit of money, I say, okay, time to go home. They're 5 years old and they say, no, we can't go home because we still have to make this much more money. Because they're not allowed to go home, even if it's midnight. Because they have to make a certain amount of. So, yeah, I have a lot to say, but let's keep the question. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We're having now, we're calling on the RPP group, is that right?
Is this on? Okay. Hi, my name is Rafaela Mueller. I'm a part of the RPP class this semester. Thank you so much for being here. This is really, really important. So I believe that I can speak for all of us in the RPP working group that we've been following the Syrian refugee crisis. And especially after the pictures surfaced of Aylan Kurdi on the shore. But the articles that all of you assigned to us kind of gave us an even deeper insight into the situation. Because at least I, for one, had never really put together all of the problems, like the trauma and domestic violence spiral, the importance of both the daily and the acute stressors, and then also the failure of the U.S. as the city on a hill to be of assistance to especially the displaced children. And just putting together those problems and their implications, not just now, but also years down the road. So it's really good to see that there is some kind of hope, especially through groups such as Amal or Salam. But we want to do something else that we can do here in the States to raise awareness or participate in other efforts. So what are some specific ways that we can do that, or some organizations that can help us organize our efforts?
I can take this question. Thank you, Rafaela. Thanks for the concern. Here, I would say, I mean, being in the U.S. At this time is maybe the most important. Like, we can play the most important role, as the Syrian cause has been internationalized in an irreversible way that Syrians cannot solve it themselves by now. So spreading awareness and lobbying towards to have a solution for Syria. I mean, the current administration was very clear that they are not interested to play any role, and we're not very optimistic for the next administration, to be honest. But we have a duty to do on this. So still lobbying. I mean, for people who works in policy, for a better policy for the coming 4 years in Syria. Syria has abandoned by the U.S. administration, and unfortunately, it was not only inactive. They vetoed almost every single proposal by the French, by the Turks about a no-fly zone and a civilian protection at that time. So pushing the administration more for a more active role into the Syrian conflict. Some other stuff. There are now a lot of Syrian American NGOs around the area. They have been doing amazing job. I'm happy to introduce you to any, and they are almost working on every single field since the crisis now has been for 5 years. So, for example, I forgot that point. In the Child Protection Network, we have tons of data, and we're looking for specialists and researchers to look at these data and provide us with a conclusion and some results. And so we can't do this work ourselves. We need some researchers, I mean, master's students, undergrad students, or even PhD students, to look at this data to help us on child abuse, early marriage problems, radicalization in the community. And we're happy to collaborate with anyone interested in this. That's my part.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think the instinct to contribute something is a very good one, though it's not so easy, as Alexandra said, to just, one might want to just sort of go and contribute, and often that's actually counterproductive in a situation where there are many outsiders trying with the best will in the world to do what they can in situations which are already very stressed. So I think, as Mohamed said, thinking strategically about one's own government and one's own community is probably the first place to start. So to think in this, complicated political situation that we're now in, what are the demands that we should make? What are the minimum, non-negotiable principles that we have to maintain? I think that's probably a very important starting point. So, to think about at least protecting refugee resettlement in the US. I think the prospects of increasing the rate of refugee resettlement are slim. but at least to protect the sort of 90,000 annual amount that we have at the moment is going to be an uphill struggle on its own, and that's very important. Secondly, I think thinking about ways of just skilling oneself to have some of the tools that are necessary for addressing the problems that arise is very important. So there are many technical skills that are very useful, whether it's psychosocial skills, or whether it's more kind of down-to-earth practical skills which will be needed for rebuilding. So, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and also, in terms of health systems and education systems. So I think there is a plethora of things that we can all be thinking about. But probably the most important thing, as Alexandra said, is just to keep this horror alive, that it just doesn't become routinized, that we don't just become so used to these images that we see daily of bombing that we take it for granted, but to kind of impress upon our political representatives that this is intolerable and we have to try to reverse it. I think that's probably the most important thing.
Are there any more questions for our RPP groups? Yes.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm also part of the RPP working group. And again, thank you so much for bringing in your experiences and insights. So in our class, we've discussed the idea of the benefits of migration, the human rights to migrate, but also the human rights to stay home, protected from war, violence, and aggression. And since there are people who either don't by their free will or cannot leave Syria, including children, my question is that what can we do to help them? And like you said, Alexandra, what can we do to show them that we have not forgotten them?
Just again, first of all, just to identify the differentiate between the migration and being refugees. Most of them, they are not migrating; they were forced to flee. So they are none of them thought of leaving their countries before. They were happy, not as happy. I mean, lots of problems, and this is why there was a revolution at that time. But just to clarify this, and yes, I agree. Actually, there are a lot of media coverage about the refugee, which is a huge problem at our moment. But the less fortunate people, which they are the ones who left in Syria, they are being slaughtered on a daily basis by the aerial bombardments. Now with the Russian air forces, they almost get no media, no coverage, and no attention. I think the most efficient way to work on more lobbying for a better policy from the international community toward those people, to stop this area bombarding as soon as we can. This genocide has to be stopped, and immediately. During the last 2 weeks, more than 600 people have been killed in Aleppo alone. We're not talking even about eastern Damascus and the ruler of the southern of Syria. So it's just crazy over there. And I think the U.S. has a huge role to play in this, and we're not doing anything. So lobbying, with working on spreading awareness, working on campaigns, anything to change the international, the public opinion, and also the policymakers' opinion on this. Cause is a humanitarian cause. This or a non-political one. This causes everything, but not to be apolitical. It's a political problem. Or the issue of the Syrian conflict, first and foremost, is political. So just not to, because now there's the majority of campaigners are trying to just deal with the humanitarian aspect of it. Yes, this humanitarian aspect is still going on because of political problems. So just not to neutralize the problem and try to to speak out loud about the root cause of the issue, which is very clear by now. I think it's not controversial anymore. It's up there in the sky, and everyone has witnessed it.
So we open it now to...
Hello, my name's Julia. I'm a student here. I just wanted to ask about the overall issue of the negative discourse around migration. And I think in one of the readings you gave us, I think it's well known that there's been a hugely positive impact of migration on many countries in the world. And I just wondered if you have any thoughts about how we can change that discourse and how we can persuade people of the benefits.
Yes, I agree with you. You know, as you say, migration has had an enormously positive effect for centuries. And I mean, we've all come from somewhere else once upon a time. So it's one of those paradoxes of, you know, the nation state that we have, this notion that borders have to be hermetically sealed. And it's actually a very recent notion, really, basically the beginning of the 20th century. So for the overwhelming majority of history, the arrival of people has been seen as an asset and as a resource rather than a detriment. I think there are ways in which we can change the current discourse over time. Obviously, nothing's going to happen from one day to the next, but there are a couple of things which I think are very important. Firstly, there's absolutely no doubt that in the medium to long term, for demographic reasons, migration is going to be critical. It's going to be critical to replenish countries where the birth rate is falling dramatically. And it's going to be critical to have a safety valve for countries where the birth rate is rising dramatically. So just a kind of natural redistribution of populations. And I think demographers have generally said, you know, the next 10 to 30 years, this is a process which is really going to be important to take stock of. That's the first point. The second point, I think, is that we need to try to move collectively in terms of public policy and migration management to a situation where we think of migration much more as flexible and circular rather than one way and permanent. And I don't think that's a chimera. I think it's possible to have that. If you think about how kind of the wealthy 1% engage with migration, that's how we engage. We have options to come and to go. We don't have a sense that once we've entered a country, we have to stay because we may never get back in again. We don't have this kind of perverse incentive to stay on even though we don't have a job or even though the economic circumstances suggest that it's not sensible. But many millions of people, of course, are trapped in exactly that situation. That's something that we need to change. So I think that the whole movement now towards the 2 global compacts that have been launched following the September 19th meeting at the UN, Global Compact on Migration and Global Compact on Refugees, have some good ideas about how migration can be facilitated. And they include, first of all, this notion from a refugee point of view of much greater responsibility sharing. So it's not possible to really live up to our obligations for humanitarian migration unless there's much broader sort of slate of participants. But secondly, if we're thinking about the other end of the spectrum of non-humanitarian migration, but just movement of people, we have to have a broader kind of toolkit. We have to have legal, safe and regular migration opportunities, for example, for young people, which hardly exist at the moment. We have to have models where flexibility is much more the norm, not just for the very privileged, but for others. And of course, that means creating incentives to move on, to return home. So I think what it really means is that to solve migration problems, we need a much broader set of instruments than just migration policy. We need development policy. We need to think about demographics. We need to think about skill training. We need to think about how we're going to use educational incentives and so on. So it does mean really collaborating collaboration between sectors that have never collaborated. I mean, those of us who are migration experts have basically just worked on migration issues. People who work on education, people who work on development, people who work on demography haven't really thought in those terms. So that is not an easy answer, but I think it's the only way to really think this through in the medium to long term.
Hello. Hello, my name is Beatrice Crystal. I teach here as an adjunct language teacher. I just have a question that it doesn't address the immediate situation, but thinking of the longer term and changing people's minds for the next 10, 20 years, the sort of the young people who are in high school today throughout this country, are there any movements to make connections between the youth in Syria and the youth here? I mean, are there any movements to go out to schools making connections between individual classes who could adopt a child or a class in Syria so that people, Americans, I mean, we're all, isolated in terms of how much information where we can get access to, we're exposed to, but if we don't hear people here maybe make a big effort, but, a lot of schools maybe not. So if we could make a human contact, as Nousha was saying, I think, that put individual people's faces in front of other people's faces so that they don't forget, and if one could do Skype sessions as we did between schools, for example. I mean, I'm just wondering if that might be something productive, just to educate the people who will be the next generation of young American adults to do something about it.
Maybe I can just jump in and start off by saying that there are already quite vibrant projects linking at the tertiary level. So not school kids so much that I know of, but certainly college level. So we have colleagues here and in other places who are really developing kind of virtual classrooms, and including with refugees. So it's very much a commitment of a whole generation actually of educators to think of ways of linking students across continents. And I think so. I know that there is work happening with Syrian refugees. There's work happening in Dadaab, for example, with Somali refugees in Kenya, and there are other examples. And there are also programs and initiatives to really make education available to people through distance learning. So really to facilitate that sort of access, even if you don't have a virtual classroom, to make it possible for people who are in very harsh circumstances with little access to explore educational opportunity. But I don't know so much about high school or lower down.
Hello, my name is Tony Khouri. I'm from Syria. I'm first year MDiv here, and I came to the United States 4 months ago, so I was in Syria through the whole period of the war. I have a question to you, Dr. Alexandra. I think there's a huge need in Syria now to deal with psychological diseases, and I'm a clinical pharmacist, and I did my master's thesis about depression among old people in Syria after the war. And I did a narrow survey, and the results were terrifying. 85% of old people had kind of depression or anxiety, and 95% of them refused to see a specialist or to take because of the stigma about going to a specialist or taking medicine for this. So, because we're today speaking about children, you can imagine how the impact of this about children of Syria. So my question is, what can we do to change this mindset about psychological support and going to specialists? And is there any ideas we can do in ground inside Syria? Thank you.
One more question.
Thank you all so much. Yecheskel Landau, Israeli-Palestinian peace educator, and American too. How can local religious leaders give their authority, credibility, pastoral gifts to make alliances with the mental health professionals and the pharmacists. So they give their halal or Christian imprimatur saying this is an obligation for the health of the community. So much is at stake. So where are the religious professionals in the mix?
It's a tough question. So, as I mentioned, the Syrian society was really shaken dramatically after the uprising. Many of the schools, I would say, like the church and also the Islamic hierarchy, to say, was shaken at that time. There was a huge split inside the school, those schools themselves. However, there are still have maybe the how to say the most or the highest voice around, and they still can do a lot of changes. There have been some of them. They have been really collaborative in the way of more awareness and education about the trauma and the difficulty that the Syrian, in terms I'm saying children and also adults, and how to deal with that regarding many of the problems of early marriage, sexual abuse, and all of that. But still not enough to the size of the disaster that we were facing. Again, the split of those religious schools themselves, it's making it more difficult to have a one voice with the humanitarian crisis, and also going further with every single year with the conflict. Things have been more radicalized on all aspects, in different ways, which makes it difficult for any to take a decision on or to make a statement, or even for their voices to be heard. Still, they have a duty, and some of them they are doing it. Others, unfortunately, are now. That's what I have.
Jackie and Mohammed and Nousha and Alexandra, thank you so much for a wonderfully rich panel, for bringing your rich knowledge and your experience. It's been moving, illuminating, inspirational, and as you see, people have been absolutely riveted. Thank you all for your attentiveness and for your wonderful questions, and please join me in thanking our panel. Can I please invite the Dean to come to, you have some closing remarks, I believe?
Just a few announcements.
Okay.
Thank you so much to our speakers, and to Nousha Kabawat in Beirut, who also played a major role in our evening. So thank you, everyone, and thank you to our RPP working group and to all of you for coming. It did, as you were speaking, and especially about how to focus attention on these sets of issues. I couldn't help thinking, in both of my experiences in Northern Ireland in the last year and a half in the United States, a kind of narcissistic obsessiveness takes control of societies about their own issues. You follow the news channels, the CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, and I bet you if you worked out the coverage minutes to what we've been talking about tonight versus the coverage minutes to the latest campaign gaffe or not gaffe or speech or trailer or the latest finalists for 5 different cabinet positions or whatever. So it's a kind of proportion thing, big time, and how we. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to focus on this, and also for the questions about thinking how we can make a difference and get out of our narcissistic obsessiveness. Wishing you all, of course, a great winter break, and hope you will join us for our spring sessions. We will keep going with our colloquium, the first of which will be on January 26th, on the topic of initiatives for healing, bridge building and empowerment to reduce gun violence in African American communities, featuring leaders doing excellent work in the Boston area. It'll be moderated by one of our own distinguished alums, the award-winning journalist and former news anchor in Boston and now minister, Liz Walker. So we've got a wonderful group of people coming to that. It's a very important topic. So please join us for that. Please stay around if you can for a bit to connect over tea and refreshments. The reception will be down this way this time because we've got another major conference on down on the other side of the building, dealing with the religiously non-affiliated in the United States. So it's a hub of activity, HDS tonight as always. So do stay around, join us for some tea and refreshments. We'd love to talk with you some more, and hopefully our panel can stay around for just a little bit. We've already trespassed on your time and good nature. So thanks again, everyone, for coming. Please do fill out the survey, and we'll see you in January. Have a great winter break. Thank you.